In this talk, James Lawrence Slattery presents their book, Taking Back Desire, a Psychoanalytic Approach to Queerness and Neoliberalism on Screen, published with Routledge in 2025. James Lawrence Slattery is a writer and lecturer living in London in the UK. They are currently lecturer in film studies at the University of the West of England in Bristol. Slattery's talk will present the key ideas behind Taking Back Desire, which studies film, television and video art texts through a Lacanian prism in order to restore a sense of queer as troubling identity and resistance to neoliberal forms of inclusion. I hope you enjoy the talk.
Okay, so thank you for coming to this talk about my book, Taking Back Desire, a Psychoanalytic Approach to Queerness and Neoliberalism on Screen, which was published by Routledge in May 2025. So this work asks three main questions. How can queerness problematize capitalism? How does Lacanian psychoanalysis introduce a refreshed way of understanding queerness as a political modality? And how can contemporary works of film, television and video art guide this political reading of queerness beyond characters who may be identified as queer? So this project started from a place of curiosity and some frustration concerning how queer has been taken up in the popular arena as an identity. So this move is demonstrated by how it is often included at the end of this kind of seemingly ever-expanding LGBTQ+ acronym, and how this grouping of identity categories has been assimilated into the regime of late capitalism known as neoliberalism. So a kind of corporate sponsorship of gay pride might be kind of one example of how there's been a kind of, a sort of co-option of an idea of queerness into capitalist discourse. I do sort of want to highlight that this is shifting, especially with Trump's two presidencies. We're seeing a kind of disentangling of this relationship. So briefly, neoliberalism here describes a form of market-centric economics that centres financial deregulation and reifies ideas of individuality and meritocracy. It redistributes wealth upwards and creates increased inequalities and disparities that hinder the environment where meritocracy could actually thrive. So therefore, neoliberalism is recognised as both an economic and a social model of politics. And importantly, there is a contradiction at the heart of neoliberalism, right? Because it's kind of economic policies stand in the way of the kind of meritocracy it proposes to promote. So it's broadly recognised as coming into a mainstream popular political discourse in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan's US presidency and Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government in the UK, though think tanks strategically dedicated to theorising and promoting neoliberalism were established in the 1940s with the Mont Pelerin Society and the Heritage Foundation, who are now best known, I think, for the Project 2025 document that outlined President Trump's plans for his second presidential term. But the Heritage Foundation were another influential think tank whose work on neoliberalism in the 1970s really shaped some of Reagan's policies. Okay. So while neoliberalism has often been taken up by the right of politics in a combination with neoconservatism, I want to talk about how neoliberalism is particularly adept at transforming that which appears outside of the norm into a consumer market and thereby imposes and defines its own norms. In this political and economic schema, we are all potential customers. If only we could find the right product to make us a better version of ourselves, a product that would help us express who we really are. As David Alderson responds to the incorporation and media sensationalism of sexuality by articulating how the freedom we are said to enjoy in contemporary Western capitalism resides almost exclusively in the freedom of choice in the marketplace. Okay. So, to quote Alderson, It is the freedom that turns object choice into a consumer choice and legitimates it as a lifestyle. And that includes the family lifestyle and diversification of it under equal marriage, but also the freedom governed by the compulsion of repressive incitement. It is the freedom that is bound to exploitative production, the freedom that carries ecologically catastrophic implications in the abundance it is promised, and the freedom that transforms all value into the singular norm of exchange value. So as Alderson describes, capitalism now presents a formation of market-based economic policies that continue traditions of exploitation, of labour, of the ecosystem, of planetary resources, combined with social relations that insist on individualism and yet reduce identifications to the role of the commodity, which must enter circuits of value and exchange. By engaging with Lacanian psychoanalysis and the negative or antisocial turn of queer theory, most prominently elaborated by Leo Bassani and Lee Edelman, my book argues that queerness can not only be read as a challenge to identity rather than identity category, but that it problematizes the very neoliberal structures that attempt to assimilate queer identity and transform it into yet another market, another commodity, and another opportunity for consumption. So, why moving image? I make this argument by studying a range of moving image media to ask, how is queerness understood as a structural position rather than a regime of representation? How does one read a moving image text as querying meaning rather than producing knowledge? And furthermore, what conventions are implicated and transgressed on screen for queerness to be inferred? Moving image offers a singular textual form in order to investigate the social, political, and psychic frameworks and relationships between queerness, psychoanalysis, and capitalism because of its relationship to time. So moving image is necessarily durational, that is temporal medium that combines several registers of time. So overall duration, the time it takes for the media to complete from start to finish, and with narrative media, the fabula, the length of time the story is set across, and the sujet, the order in which the story is told, either through linear or non-linear arrangements. So fabula and sujet are coming from Russian formalist kind of film theory. So for instance, a film may be set across 10 years and take 2 hours to run through and be told in flashbacks that are not in order, right? And then there is also the time that it takes to watch. One may pause or rewind the film, but its set duration of 2 hours remains the same. So as Todd McGowan argues, the relationship between film, but this could be all moving image, the relationship between this and time is unique. There cannot be a live performance of a film or TV episode. It would therefore not be a film or TV show, but become a piece of theatre or a play, whereas one can have, say, a live performance of music. So hopefully that is kind of gesturing to the sort of singularity of how moving image engages with temporality. And I highlight this because it is time that underpins the key understandings of queerness and neoliberalism that I explore. So the central texts that I analyse throughout the book are the TV series Pose, which aired between 2018 and 2021, the documentary Paris is Burning from 1990, the miniseries Sharp Objects from 2018, the video art of Ryan Tricartin from 2015, and the independent French film 120 BPM from 2017. And throughout this lecture, I'll offer examples of how I read these heterogeneous media texts. Importantly, while studying these films, TV series, and works of video art, queerness is not located in a discernible group of characters or narrative formulas, but as the point that meaning fails in the visual and temporal field. So examining the interrelation of Lacan's 3 orders of meaning, the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic, this diverse selection of moving image texts presents queerness as a relationship to lack, while crucially resisting the creation of a new or definitive canon. So briefly, I'm going to kind of gloss these terms that are so central to Lacan's thinking. So the symbolic refers to language, the imaginary refers to images and what we might broadly term social reality, and the real is the structuring absence of the symbolic and the imaginary. So Lacan formulates these as three interconnected rings, so they're kind of not separate, but they are different orders of meaning that he works through. So to gloss these distinctions, the word table, written out, the signifier table, and the thing that it refers to, the actual table, the signified, right, bear no resemblance to one another. The word written down or spoken does not share any of the coordinates with the thing that it is naming. But if I had a photograph or a drawing of the table, we would see this resemblance between the image and the thing it's referring to. There is still a difference, of course, between the image and the thing it refers to, but they are not the same. The word and the image do propose kind of distinct orders of meaning in how they relate to what's being signified. And I think we can think through that, thinking about how an image kind of bears a direct representational relationship to the signified, whereas the word is highly abstract. Okay. So the real can be thought of as this missing piece inherent in the expression of meaning, which is absent but required in order to communicate and access a kind of social engagement. So further to engaging with these orders of meaning, each chapter introduces and works through concepts from Lacanian psychoanalysis, such as desire, sexual difference, enjoyment, and drive, to develop this reading of queerness as a political modality and how this emerges on screen, including instances where the texts become confusing and disorientating. So, for instance, Chapter 1 opens with a critique of the FX television serial Pose and the way that neoliberalism utilises optical regimes of difference to secure its socio-economic structure. In other words, Pose provides an example of how marginalised subjects are able to be assimilated into neoliberal revisions of history by showing characters who face systemic discrimination as able to achieve an American dream of marriage and family, entrepreneurial pursuit, and other recognisable successes achieved in the narratives through hard work and beating the odds, due largely to their own volition. So the series centres Black trans women, and some examples of this might be, of this kind of neoliberal success stories, might be Angel, who we see get married in the last season of the show, even though this would have been kind of legally impossible. The show kind of creates these sort of loopholes in which she's able to achieve this quite like normative sort of fantasy. Electra up here develops a profitable phone sex business, and Blanca, the sort of main character, opens and runs a nail salon. So numerous characters and plot points from Pose are lifted or inspired by Jenny Livingston's documentary from 1990, Paris is Burning, which documented the Harlem, New York ballroom scene, an underground culture where primarily Black and Latinx gay men and trans women congregated and competed in dance and fashion competition, often judged on how real one appeared. That is, how convincingly they were able to pass as a woman or a straight man, typically. Okay, so these are also some images from Paris is Burning. This is one of the kind of main figures throughout the film who, like, we first see at the very beginning, and they have to kind of move through the door sideways to get through with this kind of elaborate dress on. This is Venus Extravaganza, who specifically articulates a sort of desire to inhabit a white upper-class femininity. And then these are images that are intercut of kind of actual affluent New Yorkers, which I'll speak to. So, Pose reimagines This era, from Paris is Burning, is an episodic melodrama set in the late 1980s, and therefore addresses the historical period that witnessed neoliberalism emerge into the dominant political regime in the US. The series' inclusion of black trans women in front of and behind the camera was a lauded, unprecedented move in the production and is very meaningful in terms of industry practice. Nonetheless, the series' political investment in neoliberal capital and the resolution that offers an image of fulfillment that aligns with capitalist demands leaves viewers with a sense of completion, the kind that Lee Edelman has often rallied against and is decidedly kind of not a queer circumstance of radical disruption to a hegemonic fantasy. So in the book, I go into sort of further details of how this sort of fantasy formation can be traced and established in the series. Rather, Pose imagines how marginalised subjects, such as black trans women, might find a way to enter the hegemonic capitalist fantasy, a fantasy that is built on the exploitation of such persons. Working class people, people racialised as non-white, and sexual and gendered minorities. Paris is Burning, in comparison, offers another perspective. While we see the ballroom participants perform straight sexuality, white femininity and middle-class employment through dressing as bankers and other forms of businessmen and the kind of upper crust types while at the balls, the film crucially also cuts to clips of these idealised embodiments, as it includes footage of affluent white New Yorkers and also kind of magazine covers that underpin the desiring economy of those class, race and gendered positions. Because we are shown ballroom participants imitating such positions before we see those being imitated, we are invited to read the success and desirability of the upper white middle class persons, not as natural but highly constructed through strict adherence to specific codes and conventions. So both those inside and outside of ballroom are caught in these sort of knots of imitation that are never able to be fully clenched, and for which there is no locatable, natural or kind of original position. So through this arrangement, Paris is Burning suggests that there is no real or authentic identity to embody or complete, and Pose, in comparison, frequently stages a way for its characters to kind of embody and become their true selves through a blend of its narrative arcs, stylized and very kind of polished cinematography, and the framing of success in the narrative. And I think that this true self that we see them become is registered in part through gendered performance, but also through achieving and entering the kind of aspirational middle class and becoming accepted by a neoliberal world of New York, right? Like the kind of the social political world doesn't have to go through a big kind of transformation in order to accept them, right? So another example of how I think about queerness as a challenge to identity rather than articulating another identity category is through looking at the work of Ryan Trucartin and his collaborator Lizzie Finch. The multi-video installation Priority Infield, of which these screenshots are taken from, was first shown at the Venice Biennale in 2015. And I read this work through frameworks of postmodernism and the staging of 24/7 temporality and spatial collapse, which Jonathan Crary identifies as a feature of late capitalism. So in these videos, Trucartin often references tropes from reality TV, for example, large quasi-domestic spaces inhabited by multiple people, direct address, confessionals, and visible camera crews. And while drawing on the affect and signifiers of reality TV, Trucartin also distorts these familiar codes and conventions, in part through the figures on screen, who are kind of messy amalgamations of gendered, racial, and class signifiers, visually ambiguous and made even more enigmatic through the purposefully disorientating camera work that often swerves, zooms in and out, uses this kind of obtuse visual overlay, some of which you can kind of see in this image. And this array of signifiers is overloaded. Images seem to be kind of stacked upon one another, as are clothing, makeup, wigs, acoustic elements such as an exaggerated voice that's kind of sampled and looped and replayed, along with other sonic samples. So importantly, the overabundance of stimuli belies the sense that there is a properly locatable identity beneath the kind of jumbled patchwork of signification that we witness on screen. In other words, the subjects appear queer to the extent that they defy the idea that there is an identity that can persist beneath their physical and behavioural markers. The videos embody Frederick Jameson's postmodernist notions of depthlessness or blank parody, as the work emphasises surface that relishes in the fluctuating play of semiotic uncertainty. They display a reverence towards the orderly presentation of the body and genre conventions as intelligible identity categories fall apart and signifiers fluctuate like heterogeneous images colliding across cyberspace. So I'm going to now think about and go through some of the ways that psychoanalysis is being drawn on in the book. So throughout the research, I turned to the work of two contemporary Lacanian thinkers, queer theorist Lee Edelman and film theorist Todd McGowan, both of whom situate temporality as a crucial dimension for understanding queerness and capitalism, respectively. Across key works, these are two of the kind of central books that I look to. Both Edelman and McGowan focus on the concept of the drive, originally developed by Sigmund Freud in 1920 as the death drive and taken up by Lacan in his middle and later periods, most notably Seminar 11, The Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis. Edelman and McGowan take up the concept of the drive as a way to think through the impossibility of satisfaction. As Lacan discusses throughout his work, as speaking beings, we are lacking subjects. Our inauguration into language, that is the symbolic, creates a fundamental alienation and lack for the subject, which cannot find closure in any substantial way. This closure is always fleeting. In Lacan's teaching, desire and lack are synonymous. As soon as we attain what we believe to be the object of our desire, a new desire emerges. However, while both these scholars are indebted to Lacan's formulation of the drive, there is little regard for queerness in McGowan's work, and similarly, no mention of capitalism specifically in Lee Edelman's book No Future, which is the text of his that I study most closely. For McGowan, capitalism relies on an investment in the future, as it is only sustained by a belief in the promise that a commodity will resolve our lack. The essence of capitalism is accumulation, and our relationship to the symbolic makes capitalism particularly appealing and propels our consumption. Edelman introduces the term reproductive futurism, or the regime of the child, who represents the investment of fulfillment within, for Edelman, all political thought. So, for Edelman, the child comes to articulate what he terms the governing fantasy of achieving symbolic closure through the marriage of identity to futurity in order to realise the social subject. For him, the queer then is figured as those not fighting for the children, those who embrace the failure to ever achieve closure, coherent identity, or the kind of foreclosing of meaning itself. In both cases, the radical position emerges as a divestment from the future and an embrace of the drive. As Lacan offers in his diagram, the drive presents a topology whereby the subject continually misses the object of their desire, but finds enjoyment in this kind of failure to achieve closure. So that's why we see the kind of movement kind of miss the object when the goal kind of and goal and aim are split. Okay, so this is the kind of, I guess, mapping of this concept. Okay, so given the centrality of the future and the drive, or repetition, in these understandings of queerness and a resistance to capitalism, my work seeks to bring these theories together to articulate how queerness specifically disrupts a kind of capitalist investment in the future. So the temporality of this understanding therefore brings forth moving image media as an area within the cultural arena in which this disruptive political position can be thought through due to its temporal structure, due to the kind of moving images temporal structure, while also rethinking how we understand the emergence of queerness on screen. The drive is most directly discussed in chapter 4 of the book, which centres the film 120 BPM and its use of strobe lighting. So 120 BPM follows a group of ACT UP AIDS activists in Paris in the 1990s, and the film features several strobe sequences that are introduced and edited to bring clubbing and dancing into a continuum with direct political action. So strobing scenes often follow scenes of direct action, and the film weaves these together through editing techniques that make the sequences overlap. In cinema more generally, strobes, pulsating flashes of light, frame bodies and environments in a manner that can alter the apparent passage of time. Often, strobing makes moving images appear as if they're running in slow motion or are a series of static pictures. And like if you've been in a club with strobe lighting, it appears like this kind of in real life as well, right? So as regular film time is constructed by the speeding up of still frames to create the illusion of movement, strobe sequences refer back to the mechanical construction of the moving image, becoming this sort of visual meta-language that wavers between stasis and action, right? Because moving image is still images sped up, and then strobe gives the appearance of a kind of return to the still image. So this distortion that occurs with strobe offers a self-reflective kind of moment to think about the status of the images being presented without necessarily compromising the realism of a depicted scene. So one of the most popular environments where strobes are used in contemporary film and television is in nightclubs. And in such instances, strobe is realistically featured whilst modifying the image and the sense of temporality by depicting characters as experiencing time beyond the regular constraints of cause and effect action. 120 BPM's starkest use of strobe comes during the film's final moments, where ACT UP stage a political funeral for one of the main characters, Sean, at an insurers gathering, which is what's being shown at the top here, following his death from HIV. During the protest, the group of now familiar faces disperse Sean's ashes across the banquet room, causing plumes to rise and settle over the elaborate canapes, flower arrangements, towers of champagne, and bewildered patrons. Inexplicably, the room becomes flooded with strobing light, and time seems to shift into slow motion, which you can kind of get a sense of with this image. The chants of political action fade, and the group begin to dance, and strobing light introduces a space that extends as a supplement to the diegesis. There's a kind of break in the sort of realism of the scene. A faint thudding sound reminiscent of a heartbeat leads into melancholic dance music, escalating as strobing begins to dominate the frame. So building into a crescendo of rhythmic light and sound, 120 BPM moves into an intensified point for its close. Faces momentarily appear frozen in the glare of light. Hair seems suspended in mid-air as the protesters kind of sling their heads in dancing abandon. By concluding with strobe lighting, 120 BPM intensifies the stakes of absence in the cinematic plane of representation as we move closer towards the final kind of ceiling of the diegetic world that's been previously constructed for us. To understand how 120 BPM offers a visual field that articulates a sense of queerness, I turn to Leo Bassani's essay, Is the Rectum a Grave? Here, Bassani elaborates upon Sigmund Freud's articulation of sexual pleasure, which, quote, interrupts the more secure narrative outline of the history of desire. For Bassani, Freud returns to a line of speculation in which the opposition between pleasure and pain becomes irrelevant, in which the sexual emerges as a jouissance of exploded limits, and the ecstatic suffering into which the human organism momentarily plunges when it is pressed beyond a certain threshold of endurance. So this affective intensity in which the self is described as kind of being shattered, and the risk of the sexual itself is the risk of self-dismissal or losing sight of the self, is read in Bassani through the figure of the male homosexual, but also the woman. So during the nightclub scenes of 120 BPM, we encounter bodies that we lose sight of and who lose sight of one another under the kind of pulsation of strobe. These sequences visualise Bassani's articulation of jouissance as that which exceeds the visible and situates enjoyment as an affect that writes the homosexual as a deviant figure. The film's kind of, obvious diegetic concern with HIV situates these bodies in a pronounced proximity to death. At the same time, the mise-en-scène enacts Lee Edelman's description of the queer's threat to, quote, the threat to the hope of filling the constitutive gap in the subject that the signifier necessarily installs, as distortive lighting through strobing renders bodies incoherent and fragmented. So such framing problematizes a kind of sense of imaginary wholeness of the figures by refusing to close the gap in the image, creating a diagrammatic screen that uses the pictorial plane to describe the symbolic order's fundamental incompletion in the realm of representation. So as with the topology of the Lacanian drive, the subject's perpetual missing piece is not filled by the regime of the image, but exemplified by the stark gap that's orbited and never resolved into visual clarity, because we are kind of only getting these flashes of light. So we'll get a kind of flash of light and then we'll be back in shadow. So the image is kind of, fragmented in quite a obvious way. So it's sort of refusing this subjective sort of wholeness within the image. Similarly, in chapter 2, I analyse the TV miniseries Sharp Objects, where I consider how the use of flashbacks and emphasis on language resist narrative coherence and read this inability to find completion through a Lacanian understanding of sexual difference. So we begin the series as Camille is sent back to her hometown of Wind Gap, Missouri, as a journalist to cover the recent murders of two young local girls, Natalie and Anne, and the ongoing investigation into finding their killer. During her extended visit, Camille stays with her mother, Adora, teenage half-sister Amma, and her stepfather, Alan. Camille played by Amy Adams in the show. So as the investigation catalyses Camille's return to Wind Gap, its unfolding occurs with viewers learning about her life via flashbacks and her interactions with various Wind Gap residents. As viewers, our impression of Wind Gap must negotiate its quaint outward kind of Americana appearance and Camille's flashbacks, which transport us to scenes of her troubled adolescence there. So at the end of episode 1, Camille has arrived back in Wind Gap, and as she eases into a bath, we see the words vanish carved into her flesh. That word forms a sort of center point within this kind of crowded, textured skin. And Camille's scarred body is alarming, and the scar tissue is healed, which indicates that these are not recent wounds. So she's covered with self-harm that is words that she's carved into her body. Okay. So even though the kind of healed scars indicate that these are from a long time ago, the word vanish still echoes the sort of recent vanishing of the young girls in the town and links this contemporary mystery to the reappearance of Camille in Wind Gap. So as the series reveals her extensive self-harm, experiences from Camille's past are understood as written into her body, as these words tether her corporeality to movements across time in the flashback sequences. As images reappear throughout the episodes and the overall series, we are given this sense of repetition and return, a sort of circling of fragmented memories which indicate moments of trauma in part because they're unable to be relayed in any sensible form. Although flashbacks offer glimpses from Camille's life, they obscure rather than elucidate the central investigation into the local murders with which they're not obviously associated. So as the town's name of Wind Gap suggests, there's always this gap in meaning, and the series continually refuses a kind of narrative and visual completion. As such, appearances in sharp objects are deceiving, and Camille's flashbacks create a schism in the surface of the American town. The series employs this kind of very distinctive, stylized, flickering editing, and sharp objects, through this kind of technique, moves between the normal present-day appearances of Wind Gap and Camille's personal recollections of violence that indicate a deception at the very surface of things. As well as introducing visual confusion, the flashbacks and apparitions, so we also see these kind of figures emerge in the landscape, disorganises the chronology of the murder investigation, which provides the linear overarching timeline of the series. This anachronic structure associated with Camille's bodily cuts is produced by the jarring editorial cuts that kind of erratically move through time and space. The linguistic signs upon Camille's body do not reveal the truth of her subjectivity, but negate a sense of closure. So Camille is marked by a language that emphasises its structural absence and which informs the series' anachronic temporality. And it's because of this that I argue that the series embodies the Lacanian feminine of sexual difference, which is understood as that which brings uncertainty to bear on symbolic law. So this partiality of the symbolic realm is gestured to in sharp objects as the flashbacks toy with the troubled relationship between word and image, with words never finding their kind of correlating image in the flashback sequences. So even when we are granted some sense of an event that may have led to one of her acts of cutting, the words refuse a kind of clear description or definition of the events witnessed. The bodily scriptures translate the function of the symbolic within the narrative schema as stand-ins that cannot fully encompass that which they are referring to. As such, the series reads signification in the feminine position, which unveils impasses in the knowledge that bases its claim on certainty, as well as arguing that the series, like 120 BPM, invites ambiguity and the inability to form completion in terms of its kind of current localized setting in the diegesis. In the second half of the chapter, I also go on to read how the town's Confederate social identity strategically represses the history of slavery as a fundamental dimension of its formation, and the way that this historical national violence kind of re-emerges in the present as these kind of contemporary murders, and the way that these sort of tear social reality. So as this engagement with 120 BPM and sharp objects speaks to, throughout the book, Lacanian psychoanalysis and queer theory inform one another as both position uncertainty and unknowability as central to their approach to subjectivity, from their kind of respective disciplines. So their insistence for both queer theory and psychoanalysis, their insistence on the limits of knowledge and the centrality of loss align. Broadly, queer theory invites us to examine how ideas of gender and sexuality develop as a series of signifiers, not as natural processes, and thus are subject not only to fluctuation and change, but importantly are never complete, and sometimes conflict with our desires. Psychoanalysis similarly foregrounds a challenge to knowledge and coherence for the subject, most prominently through Freud's discovery of the unconscious, a psychic structure that shapes us while remaining elusive and incomprehensible to us, emerging only in moments of mistakes and stumbles, when we make a slip of the tongue, or touched upon in the process of free association or dream work. In contrast, capitalism sells us on the idea that with the right purchase, commodity, lifestyle, and perhaps identity, we can become complete subjects. This promise of capitalism can be recognised as offering access to a fantasy structure, a place where our lack and alienation is extinguished. However, particularly in Lacanian psychoanalysis, this lack is a fundamental part of who we are. It is introduced as we enter the realm of language, where the radical dissymmetry between signifier and signified creates a process of substitution. While this system of signifiers offers us a way to communicate with one another, it also forges a break and abstraction in meaning for the subject. The world of language and images through which social reality is mediated for the subject is never able to offer us the object of our satisfaction, the Lacanian object petia. Only in moments of trauma or other radical experiences of interruption do we touch upon the real, that structuring absence that is normally veiled, and the repression of which allows us to negotiate what we might term everyday life. Thus, this emphasis on incoherence and the gaps in knowledge presented across queer theory, psychoanalysis, and my kind of selected media stage a challenge to the promise of potential fulfillment that capitalism relies on to remain seductive and appealing. And the way that neoliberalism specifically invites a range of identities into this updated version of consumerism, despite the diminishing returns of these political systems for our economic, social, and psychic joy. Importantly, this understanding of queerness addresses a lack that we all experience and is therefore not exclusionary. It's my own desire that we, in the broadest sense, approach lack in a way that does not seek to fill it with the trappings of consumer capitalism, but rather acknowledge, if not embrace, our very inability to garner closure. In this sense, I hold on to some optimism about queerness that manifests as a conviction that we have the right to challenge capitalist hegemony, whether we believe ourselves to be either outcasts from it or benefit from it financially or socially. It is in part by rethinking or traversing a promise of fulfillment that this challenge partially takes place. The queer orientation to lack seeks to reach towards something expansive rather than particular and closed, like identity. So I also want to say that queer offers but one way of negotiating the gap in meaning that we're all trying to fill in our different, inconsistent and failing ways. Thus, it is desire rather than identity that must be taken back. Despite now conventional thinking that often conflates our egoic personalities with the truth of our subjectivity, identities are not internal or inside of us, even as they shape so much of our communal and psychic lives. Identities are developed through symbolic and imaginary registers, and like language, are advanced in the external world that we must then adapt to. This doesn't mean that identities are not deeply felt, and they often feel as if they are our real selves. Yet categories of identity never properly fit. We're never able to find the piece that would resolve our identity and make it self-evident to ourselves and others. Instead, it is perhaps how we relate to and respond to this missing piece that can be part of our political orientation. Thank you very much.